Your former ABC colleague Bill Birtles is one of the two journalists who has been rushed home today. How significant is it to see China starting to target journalists working for Australian outlets?
Oh, look, it's just so concerning, Ash, and I'm so pleased that Bill, who's worked so hard for the ABC over so many years, is home safe, and same with Michael Smith from the Australian Financial Review, and really, good work, DFAT and ABC and Nine News for getting these journalists out safely. There would have been incredible diplomatic negotiations behind the scenes to get them home. But at Human Rights Watch, we're really concerned about the local staff who remain behind working for these organisations, about other Australian citizens who are working for foreign news outlets in China who remain there. And at the top of our concern is the fate of Chinese journalists who don't have a foreign embassy they can turn to. China is the world's leading jailer of journalists. At least 48 are behind bars. This is according to the Committee to Protect Journalists. And these are only the ones we know about. And just since what happened in Wuhan in January, you had 5 citizen journalists who were forcibly disappeared. We haven't heard anything of them since February now. And so it's incredibly concerning to see what's happened in the last 24 hours, in the last week.
Do we know when it was that China actually stopped issuing visas for Australian journalists? Is that clear?
We did see in reporting today, the ABC talk about the fact that no new visas have been issued. The same for Fairfax, for Nine News Media. And this is something that was reported last week in The Australian as well, and something I think that has now become public, the fact that Sarah Ferguson, who was appointed to be the new China bureau chief in Beijing, still hasn't been given a visa to go there and do that reporting. And it's so alarming. China is now under less scrutiny. There's a lot of American reporters who've had their visas rejected recently. A CNN journalist had new visa restrictions placed on him just yesterday. A journalist trying to get into Hong Kong the other week didn't have his application approved, something which hasn't happened before in Hong Kong. So the lack of scrutiny, Ash, is incredibly concerning for the Australian government, Australian businesses. To not have those eyes on the ground, to not know what's happening there is really damaging. And it's concerning to see how we will be able to cover China. It's so hard to know what goes on there anyway. But without those eyes on the ground, it's just going to be really difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, it's extraordinary to think that for the first time in decades, we don't have an accredited Australian journalist working for an Australian media outlet on the ground in China. It is quite remarkable. During your time, I know as a foreign correspondent in the Middle East, you worked at some of the world's most dangerous locations. You have also reported from China and Hong Kong. There are, as you point out, so many important stories to be told in China as well as Hong Kong. I assume you wouldn't go there now knowing the risks. Do you think those risks are contained to journalists, or should Australians working in other industries and other sectors also be put on notice?
Oh, I think they should be put on notice. And I just want to point out, I never reported from China because they wouldn't give me a visa despite trying. And this is just such a problem these days. So I did report from Hong Kong, and that was with some trepidation because I had done an investigation into Xinjiang, which the Chinese government did not like. And they attacked the ABC in Four Corners when we put out those allegations. And now it's common knowledge what is happening in Xinjiang, what the Chinese government is doing to their own citizens there, the largest incarceration of people based on their religion since the Holocaust. It's horrifying what's happening in Xinjiang. But to go to Hong Kong now, having done that kind of investigative work about China, I wouldn't do it because of the national security law. What has happened to Hong Kong in the past year is extraordinary. There were 300 arrests just on Sunday. You're seeing children wrestled to the ground by police. They arrested an activist for speaking, for just what he wrote on Facebook on Sunday. I think it was under rules, seditious language or something like that was the terminology. This is the problem with the national security laws. They're so broad. And it's just really alarming to see what's happening, not just in China, but across Asia. It's very difficult to get visas now to get into Indonesia. You had 2 Australian journalists kicked out of Malaysia the other week. Drew Ambrose, who works for 101 East on Al Jazeera, an award-winning Australian journalist, recently forced to leave within 48 hours or something crazy like that. So now our region is becoming similar to the place where I lived and worked for years, the Middle East. It got to the end where you couldn't get visas to so many countries in the Middle East, and you were forced to report from afar. And unfortunately, this is becoming increasingly common for Australian journalists now across our region. And the long-term consequences on on this are so alarming.
Absolutely. You congratulated DFAT a bit earlier in the interview in terms of its handling of getting these two Australian journalists home today. What about the fate of the Australian journalist Cheng Lei? She was working for the Chinese government's English news channel. We learnt last week that she's been detained. Is the government doing enough, in your view, on that front?
It's always very hard to know what's happening behind the scenes. I mean, we've just seen today Michael and Bill get home safely, and we had no idea what was going on before then. So this would be at the very top of their list. It's incredibly concerning. She's got family in Melbourne, children. She's being held in conditions that are reportedly like solitary confinement, a suicide-proof cell. The lights don't go off. She could be held without charge for up to 6 months. But more importantly, if Cheng Lei is charged, what you have to remember is that the conviction rate in China is 99%. So there is no justice there. And I think we have to remember that no one is immune these days from arrest in China, whether you're a billionaire, whether you're the former head of Interpol, whether you're a Canadian researcher. Michael Kovrig, who works for the International Crisis Group, is still being held there. The Australian citizen, Dr. Yang Hongzhen, is still it's been more than a year and a half now that he's been detained, reportedly under conditions where he's shackled, interrogated to the point where they're trying to break him. I mean, it's incredibly alarming. And what Human Rights Watch is calling for is for the Australian government to support a motion for a special emergency session at the Human Rights Council to really shine the spotlight on what's been happening at China. They've been using the United Nations system to undermine human rights, and Human Rights Watch has joined with more than 50 UN experts to call for this special emergency session. Australia is only on the Human Rights Council till the end of this year. This should be a priority for us. We need to speak up. We have tried a different tactic. We have been quiet. I don't think we can do that any longer. And we really want to see the Australian government support this motion and have this special session at the UN Human Rights Council in the next few months.
Sophie McNeill joining us live there from Human Rights Watch. Appreciate you joining us and taking the time. Thank you.
Thanks, Ash.